Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to this month's Lunch and Learn research seminar on understanding and responding to workplace trauma for frontline workers. I'm Maren Butler, the Director of Research, Linked Data and Knowledge Translation in Family and Community Services Insights, Analysis and Research, also known as FACSIAR in the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we're joining today's webinar from across New South Wales, we're all living and working on Aboriginal land that was never ceded. I'd like to personally acknowledge the Darramurrugal people, who are the owners and First Nations people of the area where I have the privilege of joining from today. I'd like to pay my respects to all First Nations elders, past and present, and extend that respect to our Aboriginal colleagues joining us today. I'd also like to warmly welcome all the webinar participants that we have with us. We have had a great response to this webinar with over 1,700 people registered. In today's Lunch and Learn webinar, we'll be discussing workplace trauma among frontline workers. We are fortunate to have Dr. Deborah Batterham from Swinburne University and Noel Macnamara from the Australian Childhood Foundation to discuss their research and findings around trauma risk. They will cover the organisational and structural factors that amplify harm and contribute to workforce instability, as well as highlighting protective strategies shown to reduce risk. Following the presentation, a panel of experts will reflect on the findings and discuss what effective prevention, mitigation and system-level responses look like in practice. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our FACSIAR webpage. Anyone who's registered for the webinar will receive the link to this recording within about a week. We've got a busy session today, so we'll move quickly to introducing our presenters. So firstly, Noel Macnamara. Noel is the Director of the Centre for Excellence in Therapeutic Care, a division of the Australian Childhood Foundation. Noel has 40 years of experience in child protection, therapeutic care, youth justice, leadership development and reflective supervision. Noel is widely recognised for his work in trauma-informed and neuroscience-informed practice, including supporting workforces impacted by trauma exposure and secondary trauma. Dr. Deborah Batterham. Deb is a research fellow from Swinburne University. She has over 22 years' experience working in specialist homelessness services and is a passionate advocate for the rights of specialist homelessness services and community sector workers. Lara Woodley. So Lara is a member of the REX delivery team and designs and facilitates education programs in the mental health and wellbeing stream. With a background in adult education, Lara has over 25 years' experience in workplace health and safety, risk management, and learning and development. Warwick Brown is a psychologist and rehabilitation consultant specialising in trauma and persistent pain, with over 25 years' experience in workplace injury and recovery. As director at Work, Occupational Health and Safety, he partners with workers, employers, insurers, and medical stakeholders to support recovery and sustainable return to work outcomes. Warwick is known for bridging clinical insights with real-world workplace systems, particularly in complex and high-risk cases. Jennifer Lalich is the Manager of Homelessness at Homes New South Wales, bringing 16 years of experience across various agencies within the Department of Communities and Justice. Throughout her career, Jennifer has led initiatives in youth justice, child protection and housing services, with a dedicated focus on embedding trauma-informed practices into frontline operations. Jennifer successfully integrates her expertise in organisational development with her academic background in social science, international relations and policy. So welcome to all of you and thank you for agreeing to be part of today's webinar. I'd now like to pass over to Noel.
Thank you very much. Seems to be, there we go. I too would like to pay my respects, acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. I'm on Bundjalung country, which is Northern Rivers, northern New South Wales. I want to begin with a question, not one that anybody needs to answer out loud, but one to sit with and reflect on. And the question is, what has stayed with you from this work? I'm guessing it's not the paperwork or the reporting requirements or the endless meetings, but rather the moments you didn't expect to carry home, a child's story, a look, the family sitting in anger and grief, a silence, the young person who trusted you enough to disclose, a decision you will revisit again and again. I have carried all of these home in my 40 years. If you work in out-of-home care or child protection, you don't just do this work, you hold it, and over time the holding changes you. It was only in the 1990s that the term vicarious trauma was coined, and it remained firmly in the therapy space for a long time, but gradually has spread across to having great meaning for many other service settings, including child protection, out-of-home care, and indeed housing. Vicarious trauma is not simply stress. It is not burnout. It is something quieter, deeper, and more enduring. It's the cumulative impact of being exposed to other people's trauma, especially through empathic, attuned engagement. It does not arrive. It does not arrive all at once. It builds story by story, moment by moment, and through the acts of bearing witness. Over time, it begins to reshape the practitioner's inner world. How we see the world from a place of possibility to a heightened awareness of danger and harm. How safe we feel, not just professionally, but personally in our own lives and relationships. How we understand trust, connection, and hope, often becoming more guarded, more uncertain, more fragile. As Perlman describes, vicarious trauma is the transformation of the inner experience, the inner schema of the individual. It is not just about what we hear, it is about what those stories begin to do to us. It can shift our beliefs about fairness and justice. It can erode our sense of control. It can alter how we hold other people and even how we hold ourselves. Very importantly, it is not a sign of weakness or a lack of professionalism. Historically, many people were treated extremely unfairly around the issue of being affected by vicarious trauma, in that the question would be raised, are you suited to this type of work? Are you really prepared for this type of work? And to question them both from a personal and professional point of view, in which case many good people have left the work because of being impacted in this way. From my point of view, it's in many ways evidence of our capacity to care deeply and to engage meaningfully with the suffering of others. Vicarious trauma is the cost of caring, but it's also something that can be named, understood and responded to with intention, reflection, and support. This matters in our sector in particular. We hear repeated accounts of abuse, neglect, and violence. We make decisions under uncertainty and risk. We sit with children whose trauma is ongoing, not historical. And unlike many professions, we cannot always resolve what we witness. There is something unique about working in out-of-home care and child protection. You're not just exposed to trauma, you are responsible for responding to it, accountable for decisions about safety, and you are embedded in systems that are often under pressure and in crisis. Research tells us child protection in particular experience higher rates of secondary traumatic stress than many other professions. But statistics don't fully capture this, because the real weight, in my opinion, comes from making decisions when there's no right answer, holding risk that cannot be eliminated, working within systems that can both protect but also harm. This is where vicarious trauma deepens, not just through exposure, but through responsibility and moral tension. Vicarious trauma is often quiet, gradual, easy to miss. It can show up in our thinking, becoming more pessimistic, risk-focused, difficulty trusting others and systems, in our emotions, feeling numb or overwhelmed, increased irritability or sadness, in our bodies, fatigue, sleep disruption, often a first sign of the impact of vicarious trauma that we push aside and move through and past at great cost. A constant sense of being on edge. In our practice, becoming overly cautious or risk adverse, or conversely feeling detached and disengaged from the work. Figley describes this as the cost of caring, the natural consequence of sustained empathy in the face of trauma. However, one of the greatest risks is not vicarious trauma itself. It is unacknowledged vicarious trauma. Because in many systems, there's an unspoken expectation: be professional, be resilient, keep on going. But when we don't name the impact, workers internalize distress as personal weakness. Teams lose the ability to reflect and process. Practice becomes reactive rather than thoughtful. Research shows that without reflective spaces, workers are more likely to experience burnout, emotional exhaustion, and reduced quality of care. The impact ends with the client. Silence doesn't protect us, it amplifies the impact. The evidence is clear. What protects practitioners, not simple individual resilience, which is often how this is presented. If only you practiced your care plan, your care protocol, why aren't you doing that? It's pushed onto the individual very commonly. It is, in my opinion, the presence of relational and reflective support around our staff. We are not meant to carry this work alone. I'd just like to repeat that. We are not meant to carry this work alone. Protection comes from context where the impact of the work is held, shared, and made sense of, not pushed aside or minimized. It lives in the spaces between people, in conversations, in supervision, in cultures that make it safe to think and feel. Protective factors include reflective supervision, a space to slow down, think deeply, and make meaning of what we are holding. Peer connection, and shared meaning making, where experiences are spoken, witnessed, and normalised. Organisational cultures that acknowledge impact, where the emotional cost of the work is recognised, not silenced. Workflows that allow thinking, not just doing, because without time to reflect, experience cannot become insight. Fuchs and Gardner highlight reflective practice is not abstract. It actively supports emotional processing, professional judgment, sustained engagement with complex, demanding work. This is not a nice to have. It is foundational to ethical, safe, and effective practice. I'd like to do a reframe. What if vicarious trauma is not a sign that something is wrong with you? What if it is instead evidence that you are engaged, that you are listening, attuning, and responding to human suffering in a way that matters? The goal is not to become unaffected. It is impossible to be unaffected by many of the stories that we share. To do that would mean losing something essential: our empathy, our humanity, and our capacity to connect. All the reasons we came into this work. The goal is to learn how to stay connected without becoming overwhelmed, remain thoughtful in the face of distress, hold the work without the work holding you. I'm going to return for a moment to what has stayed with you and add a second question. Where does that go? Because if it only stays with you, it becomes weight. But if it's shared, if it's reflected on, and if it's understood, it becomes something else. Knowledge, insight, and wiser, more intentional practice. This work will always stay with us. As I've said, this is my 40th year, and I still remember vividly matters that I was involved in when I had hair. And that's not the issue, that we won't be affected in that way. So the question is not whether we are impacted, but whether we are supported to carry this well. Thank you very much. It's done something it shouldn't have done. Just struggling to hand over at this point to Deb.
That's okay. I think I can take control from here, Noel.
Fantastic. Thank you, Deb. Well done.
There we go. I'll just move forward through the slides. There we go. Thank you, Noel, for such a beautiful and insightful presentation. And I think those reflections resonate really well right across the social care sector, well beyond child protection. So thank you for so beautifully articulating all of that. So in my presentation, I'm going to share some findings from a recently released report. It's the first national study that is focused on workplace trauma in the homelessness and social housing sectors. I had the privilege of leading a wonderful team that included Emma Barnes, Chris Hartley, Kathleen Flanagan, Catherine Robinson, Perrette Veroya, and Jess McElprang. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the lands of the Wurundjeri Willem people of the Kulin Nations in Naarm or Melbourne. And I'd also like to acknowledge any people in the room today with lived or living experience of homelessness or social housing, and those working on the front line. The challenges that you both face are interconnected. So we use the term workplace trauma as an umbrella term to capture a range of experiences and sources of trauma. So workplace trauma in our research refers to the direct and indirect exposure to traumatic events, situations, or information that people experience as a result of their work and the consequences of that exposure. Exposure could be a one-off event, but most likely is a series of events that occur repeatedly on a regular basis that have a cumulative impact. I'll talk about four main things in my little block of time. So firstly, I want to talk about the multiple and intersecting sources of harm for frontline workers, the impacts on workers and how these flow through to organisations and the sector as a whole. I want to touch briefly on current practices and their limitations, and then I'll wrap up by sharing some of what workers said is needed to make their work safer and more sustainable. So the findings that I'm presenting are based on interviews with stakeholders and frontline staff, as well as a national survey that we did with almost 600 frontline workers across homelessness and social housing services. So a range of things are causing harm to frontline workers, and I'm going to work my way down this list. And firstly, trauma is woven into the day-to-day work of frontline workers through the challenges of supporting marginalised people. And to be clear, this is not the only or most significant source of trauma, but I'm starting here, I think, because there's been so little research done on the content and exposure of workers in these sectors. So this figure is a selection of negative events and experiences that workers have working with people experiencing homelessness or in social housing. And we use clients or tenants in the figure. So the red bars represent the percent of our survey participants who had experienced these things either directly themselves, had witnessed them at work, or had them happen in their workplace. So almost universally, workers were hearing details of traumatic experiences, including abuse and torture, talking about suicidal ideation and doing suicide risk assessments, and dealing with people who were substance affected. Most workers also experienced threats to kill or harm them and their families. 86% of frontline workers have been concerned for their physical safety at work. 59% have experience of physical assault in their workplace, and 28% reported experiences of sexual violence from a client or tenant. 78% had had a client die, and the same amount have had a client attempt or complete suicide. And in addition to all of that, overdose, family violence, and child abuse and neglect are also commonly encountered. So these statistics reflect the traumas that people experiencing homelessness or living in social housing are grappling with, and are linked to the increasing complexity of trauma and needs of this group. So as one SHS or homelessness worker explained, 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't have the level of client complexity that we do today. Now we're working with clients who have severe mental health issues, serious drug and alcohol problems, legal issues, and involvement with child protection. Exposure to negative events and experiences is routine in the work, and depending on the service, critical incidents could occur weekly or even daily. It's not just that these negative events and experiences are common, it's that because of a lack of resources, in particular housing options, workers are also struggling to provide meaningful help and feel morally compromised by what they can offer and the decisions that they have to make. Reflecting on Noel's presentation, workers bear witness to immense suffering and despair, and they experience that despair themselves. As one participant shared, it gets to the point where you just think, oh my God, the world is broken. What are we even living in? The physical violence and the threats we deal with is one thing, but the relentless emotional toll, that's massive in housing. So moving on now to organisational and sector-wide issues that are causing harm. So these experiences occur in the context of overwork and understaffing and consistently not being able to meet demand. As one worker explained, staff vacancies can go unfilled for months. Insecure funding for SHS in particular was an issue that was identified by both frontline workers and the stakeholders that we interviewed, and it adds unnecessary pressure to jobs that are already under-resourced with high trauma exposure. We heard about high staff turnover and staff shortages right across these sectors, and we also heard about psychosocial hazards, which are further compounding the harm in highly trauma-exposed work. So issues such as a lack of or poor supervision, bullying and harassment, poorly managed organisational change, and isolated work for after hours and outreach or outpost workers are compounding harm. And a key thing that these psychosocial hazards have in common is their negative impact on relational care in the workplace. So systemic issues also impact on day-to-day work in these sectors and contribute to workplace stress. And on this point, some researchers in Canada have coined the term systems trauma, which speaks to the idea that the same structural factors that create homelessness and poverty or prevent their resolution also flow through to workers in services and cause them harm. So we developed a series of statements to reflect systems trauma in the Australian context and asked participants how much they agreed that these were issues, which was the overwhelming majority of our survey participants, and then how much stress they experienced from 7 different system level challenges, and they're listed here in the figure. And the majority of workers rated each of these options as causing major strain. So this is perhaps another level of the deepening of trauma that Noel spoke about. We heard reflections from multiple participants that homelessness and social housing services are very much services of last resort and are being asked to carry the load of both the housing crisis and a lack of funding across the whole social care system. So workers in our study identified a range of negative physical, emotional and mental health impacts from their work. We included 3 validated tools in the survey to screen for symptoms of PTSD, vicarious trauma and burnout, and this figure shows the results of these tools. So 43% of workers in our survey screened positive for PTSD symptoms. We can't diagnose people with a screening tool, but that positive screen does indicate that workers should follow up with a psychologist for a full assessment, and that is 43%. Nearly half of participants, 47%, scored high for vicarious trauma, with a further 44% scoring moderately. So that suggests widespread vicarious trauma among the workforce, and 61% of our participants reported 1 or more symptoms of burnout as well. So there's significant and widespread harm to the workforce at present. These impacts on individual workers flow through to the rest of their team, to their work with clients or tenants, and to organisations and the sector. So service delivery is impacted by either desensitisation to people's trauma or increased reactivity. Injured staff taking leave means other workers take on increased workloads, which then increases their risks of harm and makes it difficult to provide a service. Organisations are impacted then again through high staff turnover and increased staffing costs. A range of practices are currently in place across these sectors. So most organisations have formal systems and structures, including incident reporting processes, employee assistance programs, and workplace policies around critical incidents, managing high-risk situations and safety. They also often have policies around training and supervision. But what we see very clearly in the data is a disconnect between what exists on paper and how it's experienced by workers. So incident reporting systems were experienced mostly as burdensome and rarely leading to meaningful follow-up or change. EAPs were often described as impersonal or a tick box response, where responsibility for trauma is shifted onto the individual rather than addressed systematically in the workplace. Supervision is widely present, but often lacks trauma-informed depth. So less than half of workers reported supervision actually helped them understand their stress responses or the emotional impacts of the work. And that was, I think, 45% for our overall sample. But when we focused on workers in the public housing space in particular, it was only 19% of workers who felt they were getting that support and supervision. Importantly, most support systems are oriented towards critical incidents rather than the cumulative everyday exposure to trauma that workers experience. And current practices are also limited by broader system constraints, such as time pressures, staffing shortages, and high workloads, which combine to limit the ability to engage in training, supervision, and reflection. We found also that trauma was heavily normalised as just part of the job. So our participants also provided us with a whole range of suggestions for what they needed to make their work safer. And we've summarised these into an agenda for change. In the occupational health and safety space, we have the hierarchy of controls, which arranges actions or hazard controls in order of the greatest impact in preventing or reducing harm. The actions with the greatest impact sit at the top in that sort of blue and green space, while those with the least impact at the bottom. There's detailed information in our report on solutions, so I'm just going to give an example of each category today. So starting at the bottom, in terms of improved supports for staff to manage exposure, we could centrally provide EAPs, ensuring expertise in homelessness and social housing work, capacity for ongoing support from the same counsellor, and longer periods of support. We could also resource peer support networks of frontline workers and acknowledge that the importance of peer-to-peer relationships at the moment in really keeping things running at present in the absence of broader sort of structural support. In terms of changes to organisations, policies, procedures and practices, we could embed clinical supervision and reflective practice and focus in particular on safety and wellbeing for casual and after-hours staff who are often working with fewer peers or with less knowledge of the people that they're working with. In terms of physical changes to workplaces, we could implement trauma-informed design in the architecture and interior design of services. In terms of reducing exposure, really that's improved work design. So things like increased staffing levels, including backfill, smaller case or tenant loads with guardrails to prevent overwork. And we could improve paying conditions to retain skilled staff and help address staff shortages in the sector. In terms of reducing the risk, we could reduce overall staff and client distress by increasing the supply of both social housing and crisis accommodation, and we could increase social work support for tenants in social housing so that they don't re-enter homelessness and there's help to access other supports that they need. Significant additional funding is needed to make these changes, but doing so will reduce the harm to workers as well as improve services. In terms of making these changes, we've done a bit of a to-do list on who can do what bits. So returning to health and safety again, a key principle in the health and safety space is that the workers who do the work have the best understanding of what will make their work safer and what's actually feasible in practical terms. So as governments, employers, peaks and unions work towards change, frontline workers need to be at the centre and intimately involved in any changes to their day-to-day work. So I'll just touch on these very quickly because I'm conscious of time. There's obviously an industrial piece for unions. So in terms of improving award conditions, so rates of pay, leave entitlements, flexibility, and by improving the award, that will also help workers who are on enterprise agreements because it lifts the floor for everyone. Governments obviously have a role in terms of funding changes and in instituting guardrails around work design. So they could go in service guidelines, be part of the service commissioning process or on quality standards. Employers can do work around understanding better their OH&S obligations. We found that was quite variable. Through our field work, we had different reports, in particular around psychosocial hazards as an education piece there. And a range of other things they can be doing in terms of job design, specific position descriptions, policies and procedures. I will leave it there, and I'll sum up by saying that workers' health and safety is not only a product of the work they do with clients and tenants, it is inextricably linked to their conditions, to the design of their jobs, to the way that organisations operate, the systemic context in which homelessness occurs and services are funded and delivered. Urgent change is needed and necessary. If you'd like to read our full report, there'll be a link on the landing page as well. There's one up here, and these are also just a couple of resources here to support actions on controlling psychosocial hazards in general in the community sector.
Thank you, Deb and Noel, for your wonderful presentations today. They were really great. So we're going to now come to the Q&A section with our panel. And just a quick reminder that if you do have any questions, just add them into the chat and we'll come to those if we have time at the end. So we'll start with Lara. So Lara, what is REX and what training programs does REX offer to support the prevention and management of vicarious trauma? And what are your top tips for preventing vicarious trauma in the workplace? Thank you.
Thanks, Merrin, and hi, everyone. My name is Lara Woodley. So I work for REX, and REX stands for Risk Education Express, and it's the education service on behalf of iCares Insurance for New South Wales. REX offers New South Wales government agencies a suite of learning programs and resources to help build your capabilities. This service is complementary to all New South Wales government employees. In terms of training, we have two core offerings in the vicarious trauma space, one for frontline workers and one for managers and team leaders. We have a 3-hour virtual program called Managing Vicarious Trauma, and this program defines vicarious trauma and also distinguishes vicarious trauma from burnout and compassion fatigue. This program identifies strategies to contribute to post-traumatic growth and also vicarious resilience. Also includes reminders around your self-care. We have a manager level program called Building Resilience when Working with Trauma, and that's a full day face-to-face program aimed at people in support roles. This program defines vicarious trauma and burnout and the risks associated. It outlines how to identify signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma in those you may be supporting. It also helps apply a trauma-informed care approach to supporting others and explains and expands on a range of support mechanisms available, including sustainable self-care practices. In the webinar post-event notes, there'll be a link to our REX portal page for you to view these and our other programs in the mental health and wellbeing space. In terms of tips for managing vicarious trauma in the workplace, it's really important to note that there's no one-size solution for this. PCBUs need to implement various levels of control. PCBUs also have a legal obligation to reduce and manage risk. And as Deborah referenced in her talk just before, she referenced the hierarchy of controls. And I've got some, advice and tips here around applying those controls with a psychosocial lens, because it's more than just the exposure to trauma. There's all the other psychosocial aspects that are, contributing to the impacts of this in the workplace. So in the traditional hierarchy, we have things like eliminate, substitute, engineer, isolate, and the admin and PPE controls. In the psychosocial hierarchy of control, it's more around redesigning the work, making reasonable adjustments to the work, but also providing that education and promotion of support. And as Noel mentioned in his talk, there's often that emphasis on what the worker can do to manage their response, following their own self-care plan and being responsible for their own resilience. And while that's important, I think it's also important to shift the focus on what the PCBU should be doing and what they should be doing that we call reasonable and practicable. And that's in terms of those controls. So when you start at the hierarchy of control, the strongest part to start at is the top. So can we eliminate or can we change the work? In the nature of this work, it's often very difficult to eliminate the risk because you have no control over the nature of the people and their responses or reactions that you might have to deal with. You also don't often have control over where you have to go to do your job. So we move to the next level in terms of that design or redesign of work. What can we do to redesign the work to minimise that exposure? Because I can't often eliminate. So can I design the work to minimise the risk of workers having to work alone? Can we change the system of work and our processes to use technology or eliminate the risk of exposure? So, for example, What can I do online or on the phone prior to attending a site? Do you have a database, and do you attach warnings for locations or sites where incidents may have occurred, or where people with known challenging behaviours or history of violence might be residing? If you do this, you can then create a list of hotspots, and then perhaps in those hotspots you apply stronger controls for people visiting those areas. It's also important to encourage workers to record their notes and history into the file for that particular case or location to then help people determine their controls prior to visiting. Then the next level down is what can you do to adjust? So adjustments revolve around things like systems, policies, processes. Can you review and adjust your rosters and hours worked in areas with higher risk or higher exposure? Are you reviewing caseloads? Are you ensuring an even distribution of those complex high-risk matters? How can you improve communication mechanisms, particularly when you're on site, in terms of your fixed or personal address alarms? Are you using radios, etc., to stay in touch? Also, an interesting one, have you reviewed the uniforms and PPE people are wearing to minimise exposure and that perceived threat level? Often high-vis vests, for example, even though it's your uniform, can be seen as a threat from people that are vulnerable. So we've had a look at the top levels of the hierarchy of control, now moving down to the section at the pointy end, which is around changing the worker. And this is that area around education, also promotion. So what are we doing in terms of provision of information, instruction and training for people who work with tenants or clients who pose a risk to their health and safety? Are you providing training in de-escalation techniques, for example? Also encouraging reporting. So internal reporting of hazards, incidents and near-miss events, and also training workers in how to escalate these issues to managers. It's also important that we give people permission to leave an area or a site if they feel unsafe or threatened. The final level of the hierarchy is around promotion. So are you promoting your opportunities to build resilience? Yes, we all have an EAP, but how are you actually promoting that rather than just popping a poster on the wall? Are you engaging and encouraging people to engage with that service? Also giving people training and support in having debriefs, even peer-to-peer debriefs after an incident or a traumatic event has occurred. So there are many ways that you can help reduce and minimise these risks. This is obviously a very high-level overview, but the controls that you do put in place for your agency need to be tailored, need to be targeted to that particular work area. The way you can do that is then consulting with your workers, and they can help in identification of hazards, but also workers usually have good opinions on what will work in terms of controls for their particular work and their areas. So that's it from me. There will be a link to further resources on the post-webinar page. So back to you, Merrin. Thank you.
Thanks, Lara. There's just a couple of questions in the chat, just asking whether REX is available for non-government organisations, workers.
No, so that's a great question. So unfortunately, it's to do with how the workers' compensation premiums are paid. So it's primarily in a prevention response to government agencies because of their policies with us.
Great, thank you. Okay, Warwick, from your vantage point as a psychologist working directly with injured workers and with organisations, where does responsibility for vicarious trauma actually sit? Is this a clinical problem that workers need to personally manage and recover from, or is it a systemic failure that organisations are obliged to prevent? And what have you seen work well to support those who have been exposed to vicarious trauma? Thanks.
Thanks, Merrin. Obviously, it's quite a complicated question, and I think everyone has addressed it exceptionally well so far. And I think I'll probably repeat quite a few of the points that have already been made. I think from my position as a psychologist for 22 years and supporting both organisations and injured workers and seeing all those sort of aspects, we see the impact of this on both the organisation and the worker. So I think the responsibility is shared across all of those. I think both Noel and Deb made some really good points, and one of the elements that we see here in our rooms from a treatment perspective is typically workers can cope with a lot of what they do. They love the work, they enjoy it, and where the failure or where the impact often comes is in that feeling lack of support, lack of safety, typically from that organisational level. So people can often cope with a lot of the distress or the impact of the work if they are supported, feel safe, and And when that fails, then we tend to see the result of that sort of moral injury type situation that we end up with injured workers basically in our rooms. So I think from an organisational point of view, things that we've touched on already are important: systems, structures, supports, and really addressing that high level risk factors, the psychosocial hazards that Lara has mentioned, and I think Deb also made mention of the things that are there to sort of provide that overall structure and support for workers on the front line. And I think that's a real important element, and where we try and partner with organisations to ensure that those elements are met and are coordinated, and that support is put in place. I think the other thing that was made mention too is early intervention being important. When people start to notice some of these symptoms, the high level of distress, the high level of PTSD symptoms, and the mention was made of the challenges of relying probably too heavily on structures such as EAPs that aren't really designed for this type of need often. And so I guess, again, partnering with organisations to ensure that early intervention is coordinated, is structured, and is designed appropriately, and so that it is not just a it's your problem, go and deal with it in a short-term basis, and then, you know, good luck type scenario. So I think where we try and look at that is making sure that we are partnered up with organisations to see where those risks are identified, to see those factors that are starting to highlight some of the key problems that people experience. I noticed in the chat, it's sleep issues, it's all those symptomatic problems that often can't be addressed in just a simple EAP type service. I think then those are really critical elements. Then we move on to the treatment side of things, and I think where we then support workers with that is ensuring that we have appropriate treatment, we have a match care model. A lot of these symptoms and a lot of the problems that we've identified today come out not only as a psychological issue, but in physical burden too. So within our practice and within our organisation, we ensure that we pair treatment to include physical therapies, exercise physiologists, and we match that with our psychological treatment, shared goals, ensuring people can recover quickly, undertake treatment modalities such as trauma-focused CBT, EMDR, and all the things that really support an injured worker at that end point, unfortunately, when they do end up in our rooms. And so I think having that level of support, but I think one of the key takeaways is that it's not an individual problem often. And I think as an overall addressing issue, it's that organisational responsibility that then trickles down to ensure that our workers are safe and supported and looked after. So I think where we try and partner and to address this overall issue is in assisting with culture, with leadership, with supports, ensuring people feel safe, and then any early interventions that are appropriate, and then at the back end from a treatment support and appropriate trauma-focused care. So I guess that's a high-level summary from what we see in our rooms over 20 plus years of dealing with frontline workers and the experiences that that they share, and I think it's reflected really well in the presentations of both Noel and Deb today.
Thanks, Warwick. And Jennifer, the question for you, what's something you wish managers better understood about the impact of vicarious trauma?
Thank you, and hi everyone. My name's Jen. So I wanted to present today on something that would be relatable. So it hasn't had a heavy focus today, but it has been named in the research. And basically what it is around connections. So I feel like with vicarious trauma, what it does to us on the ground is force us to adapt to our environments subconsciously so we can cope. How this tends to translate is what I have seen in my time, or what I describe as the Superman Clark Kent mode. It's an emotional and mental armor, so to speak, but I'll get into it and explain it a bit more in a moment. I've seen this mode in all of the DCJ roles I've worked in, including youth justice, child protection, and housing services. The Superman Clark Kent mode isn't something we're trained for or that colleagues explicitly detail when we're mentoring new staff. It develops from our experiential learning. It's our trauma response and our work survival mode, because we can't fight, it's not professional. We can't flight, we wouldn't get paid. We can't freeze, we have to help. And we can't submit. We wouldn't be the strong support and advocate clients need us to be in that moment if we did. We all know Superman and Clark Kent are the one person. I believe frontline workers are Clark Kent at home and a Superman at work. The cape comes out because it has to, and we take the cape off when we walk out the door or when we log off, so there's a clear separation between our work persona and our home persona. Neither persona is less than, Clark's important, and so is Superman. Where there's a risk is when we're not Superman at work any longer and we blend the two personas. Because of the level of trauma we're dealing with, we've heard it today, and the frequency of it, every single person will lose their Superman persona at work at some point. For some, we quickly pick up that cape off the ground. We see it was stuck to the legs of our chair and we pick it up ourselves. For others, we rip off that cape ourselves and we can't stand the thought of looking at it again for hours, days, weeks, sometimes months, some people ever. Me personally, I've had that moment myself. It wasn't pretty, and I unfortunately didn't have the right supports around me in the workplace that have been mentioned throughout the research and today's presentations. That's why I'm so passionate about this area as a manager, and why it's one of the biggest focuses I have for every single staff member in my team. I think for most people though, it's our colleagues that tap us on the shoulders to let us know we dropped our capes. We're fortunate that our colleagues see the smallest changes in ourselves that we may have missed ourselves. Because we know each other so well, or should, in a really positive working environment, our colleagues notice changes. I guarantee you there are signs for every staff member and they're always different. For one staff member, it might show in their written work. Someone who crosses their T's and dots their I's all of a sudden is sending through work that's rushed. For someone else, it shows up in their one comment that's not in line with how they've been throughout their career, and it makes you raise your eyebrows when you hear it. For someone else, they're a healthy eater and then all of a sudden they're downing chips at their desk. What I'm getting at here is how people manage vicarious trauma is through their connections. When we all know each other's Superman and each other's Clark Kent, we then know when a colleague isn't Superman anymore. And then we can get on top of addressing vicarious trauma and how it's impacted someone and that it's snuck in before it becomes a bigger issue. We all know Superman can't talk to any Tom, Dick or Harry about his challenges and fears, his experiences and emotions, the way he had to rescue, but he was secretly worried he might not get that kid off the train tracks in time, because people just wouldn't get it. Superman has to go to other superheroes. And at work, we're all each other's superhero because we just get it. It's what we all joke about and call trauma bonding, but it's definitely a thing. And I'm sure a lot of you are nodding right now thinking about it. We just understand why something at front counter or out in the field was confronting. We get what it feels like to be stoic and supportive and save the day, even when we're secretly breaking inside or feel so deeply impacted or sorry for the person standing in front of us, we personally want to cry and give them a hug. We understand what it truly means to be a superhero. It's not in our role description, but really it's the air we breathe within our role. We can't just have transactional relationships at work and in our teams. We have to have meaningful relationships. What I'd love for managers to know is to absolutely foster connections within your teams, and true connections. See them as positives. When two people are going out for coffee together and they've had a break longer than 15 minutes, so be it. They're actually helping you and they're helping each other. When your teams ask for time offline for a social event, to bond, listen to them, make it happen. Don't meet them with, we can't get coverage or we've got too much to do. If someone's venting for 20 minutes about something after having a hard interaction on the phone, don't refocus their attention back to their work. Let everyone chatter in the group amongst them. Whatever's naturally happening, let it happen. Don't think about the extra clients that you can see out the front or that the phone queue line's going into double digits. Consider a loud working environment a positive working environment, the same way that you would see a family dinner at home, a loud one as positive and a quiet one as though there's something up and something going on. It's an indication that connections are there. It's a win, a protective factor, a safety blanket, and lots of sets and eyes and ears to look out and care for staff members and to notice who isn't Superman in that moment. And if your team is a manager and your working environment is quiet, consider it a red flag and ask yourself as a manager, do I know my team's Superman and their Clark Kents? Do they know each other's? If the answer is no, you're in the danger zone. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. That was great. That really resonated. I can see lots of sort of comments in the chat. So look, we've run out of time to go through any questions, but what I'd like to do is to go to each of our speakers with one final question, which is, what's the one takeaway message you would like to leave our audience thinking about at the completion of the session? So if we go to Noel to start.
I think I repeated this twice before, but we can't do this work alone. I think Jen was saying there, this connection, the nature of the relationships we have are incredibly important. And that goes to what everybody else has said too, that this is an occupational hazard. We're in this together. It's not any individual's responsibility.
Thanks, Noel. Deb?
I suppose I would say that trauma, probably right across the social care system, is never just vicarious. It's also direct trauma. It's structural within organisations and within the systems that people operate in as well. Change requires government, service providers, peak bodies and unions to work together collectively with workers at the centre to make change and improve things. This isn't something that just one person can fix. We've all got jobs to do, but it requires a collective solution.
Thank you. I'll go to Lara.
Oh, thanks, Maren. I was going to echo both Noel and Deborah's sentiments that it's certainly not a single line of responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. I think there's power in that individual resilience and self-care, but there's also power in peer-to-peer support, as Jennifer has mentioned, but also making sure that there's a range of things available to help manage, firstly, the impact, but also the post-support processes and controls. Thank you.
Thank you. Warwick?
Yeah, 100% agree with everyone so far. I think takeaway is find partners, whether that's in a workplace or externally, that importantly can provide end-to-end support and solutions. So it is a complex issue, and finding the right partners is important in that.
And Jen?
Just essentially that connections are our saving grace and they're the dark horse of vicarious trauma, really, in the workplace.
Great. So I'd just like to thank all of our presenters and speakers again. It's been a really fantastic session today, as evidenced by the really supportive and positive comments in the chat. So everybody who's registered for the event will receive a link to the recording in the next week or so. And as I think a few people have mentioned, there's some additional links and materials will also be listed on the Lunch and Learn webinar site. We'd also like to invite you to our next Lunch and Learn, which will be held on Thursday, the 18th of June at 12 p.m. And that webinar is going to be about the Pathways of Care longitudinal study, which follows children and young people who are in care. And it's looking at the 10 years of that study, as well as some recent findings around restoration. So if you're on our Lunch and Learn mailing list, you'll be notified about that soon. But thanks again to everybody who presented and came along today to listen, and have a great day. Thank you.